Good morning. Thank you for being here today. I am joined by my colleagues, Carol Lee, the Special Agent in charge of the Albuquerque Division of the FBI, and Renee McDermott, the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Albuquerque Division of the FBI. We are here this morning to announce the filing of an indictment that charges Thomas Rodella, the Sheriff of Rio Arriba County, and his son, Thomas Rodella, Jr., with federal civil rights violations and falsifying documents. The indictment also charges the sheriff with violating the federal arms laws. Sheriff Rodella and his son, Thomas R. Rodella, Jr., were arrested without incident earlier this morning in Espanola by the FBI. They were initialed here in Albuquerque at 10 this morning, and the detention hearing is set for 2 p.m. this afternoon. We take little pleasure in bringing charges against any law enforcement official because we know that the vast majority of law enforcement officers work courageously every day to make our communities safe. However, because those officers deserve our respect and support, it is vitally important that we prosecute officers who violate their oaths of office and the public trust placed in them. And the public should know that the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI are committed to holding law enforcement officers accountable when they violate their sworn duty to uphold the Constitution. Before I discuss the charges in the indictment with you, I want to let you hear from FBI Special Agent in charge, Lee.
Good morning, everybody. As a lead agency for the enforcing federal civil rights laws, the FBI wants to make it clear that no one is above the law, regardless of the uniform or badge you wear. Those charged with upholding the law must and will be held accountable. Today's arrest serves notice to those who would abuse their office and violate the public trust. The FBI will thoroughly investigate every and all allegations, and the U.S. Attorney's Office will prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. I want to thank the FBI special agents and our staff and the U.S. Attorneys and AUSA Terranita from the U.S. Attorney's Office for this investigation. Again, as I said, we hold the public trust to be the most important thing that we do as part of our role as law enforcement. And when that's broken, again, the FBI will make every effort to investigate those violations and make sure those that are doing it are brought to justice. Thank you, sir.
Sheriff Rodella and Thomas R. Rodella, Jr. are charged in a 5-count indictment that was filed under seal by a federal grand jury on August 12, 2014. The indictment was unsealed following their arrest this morning. The indictment against Sheriff Rodella and his son, Thomas R. Rodella, Jr. arises out of a March 11, 2014 incident. It occurred in Rio Arriba County in New Mexico, during which the two men allegedly engaged in a high-speed pursuit and unreasonable seizure of a young man. Count 1 of the indictment charges Sheriff Rodella and his son with conspiring to violate the victim's civil rights by subjecting him to an unreasonable seizure while acting under color of law. If convicted on this charge, each faces a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. Count 2 charges the two men with subjecting the victim to an unreasonable seizure while acting under the color of law. It alleges that the offense against the victim involved the use of a dangerous weapon and resulted in bodily injury to the victim. If convicted on count 2, Sheriff Rodella and his son each face up to 10 years in prison. You will note that counts 1 and 2 allege that Sheriff Rodella and his son, Thomas R. Rodella, acted under color of law. Acting under color of law means that a law enforcement official or public official, like the sheriff, acted in his official capacity or claimed to do so in depriving a person of his civil rights, or that he abused or misused his official authority by going beyond the bounds of his lawful authority. A private citizen like Thomas R. Rodella Jr. can be viewed as acting under color of law if he participates in conduct with a person he knows to be a public official. Count 3 charges Sheriff Rodella with brandishing a firearm during a crime of violence. If convicted of this charge, the sheriff faces a mandatory 7 years in prison that must be served consecutive to any other prison sentence imposed on the other charges in the indictment. Counts 4 and 5, Sheriff Rodella and his son, respectively, it charges Sheriff Rodella and his son, respectively, with making false statements in law enforcement reports regarding the events giving rise to civil rights charges in counts 1 and 2 of the indictment. Generally, the indictment alleges that the sheriff and his son violated the victim's civil rights by subjecting him to an unreasonable seizure on March 11, 2014, and then making false statements about the incident. The indictment includes the following factual allegations. As I recount these factual allegations, please remember that they are only accusations at this point, that the United States must prove in court. The first ones are Sheriff Rodella and his son were in the sheriff's personal vehicle when they engaged in a high-speed pursuit of the victim and used the sheriff's vehicle to block the victim's vehicle on a dead-end lane. Sheriff Rodella, who was not in uniform, jumped out of his vehicle with a firearm in hand, entered the victim's vehicle, and assaulted the victim with a firearm. Sheriff Rodella instructed deputies of the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office to arrest the victim and detain him at the Rio Arriba County Detention Center. The sheriff and his son, Thomas R. Rodella Jr., falsely represented to the arresting deputies that the victim had attempted to injure the sheriff. The sheriff and his son each made false statements in law enforcement reports regarding the events underlying the victim's arrest. And finally, both men falsely claimed that the victim attempted to injure the sheriff by trying to run over him. Before Special Agent in Charge Lee and I take questions, I want to remind you again that the charges and allegations in the indictment are only accusations, and that Sheriff Rodella and his son, Thomas R. Rodella Jr., are presumed innocent unless the United States is able to establish their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. We'll now take any questions you have.
Who's the sheriff since he's been arrested?
That will be up to the county to decide that question.
Do you know what the motive for the crime is, or do you have any sense, or can you say anything about what the motive for this incident was?
You're asking for speculation at this point, and I can't speculate.
Maybe you can answer, maybe you can't, but I'll ask anyway. Do you expect any additional charges on Sheriff Rodella for any other crimes?
This morning, all we're dealing with is what took place on March 11th of 2014 of this year.
Would you be able to say if you have any other active investigations regarding Sheriff Rodella?
I can't comment on that. All I can talk about is the indictment that was unsealed this morning.
Sheriff Rodella's attorney noted that there is nothing in the indictment from the one eyewitness to the incident on March 11th, and he wondered kind of aloud whether the one eyewitness testified before the grand jury. Can you comment on that?
The facts that we talked about this morning are the facts that are listed in the 14 overt acts in count 1. I'm going to stay with that this morning.
Did he say anything when you all arrested him?
At this point, I'm not prepared to be able to say what he said.
Especially, can you talk about how cooperative he was during the investigation? I mean, there's no indictment of him making false statements to you guys, but was he cooperative in the investigation?
Well, at this point, I think it's, again, we're only dealing with here today what's stated in the indictment itself and what occurred on March 11th.
Just to confirm, Rodella Jr. is not a deputy? I just want to, or is he? He is. I was confused.
Well, that is, again, we're dealing with what happened on this date in particular, and that's in question, whether he was or was not a deputy. And you're talking about Rodella Jr., right?
Yes.
Yes.
So we don't know.
Well, that is in question at this point.
Have you asked him?
Again, I'm going to stay with the facts that are in the indictment.
Wait, I'm so confused. Does the Law Enforcement Academy have any sort of certification that Rodella Jr. is certified to be a law enforcement officer in New Mexico or not?
Well, at this point, let me, again, I want to stay with the facts that are in the indictment. There's been statements that he is that he is a reserve officer, but at this point, that is in question on the date in question for the indictment.
Mr. Rodella's attorney also mentioned in court this morning that he felt like, given that the indictment was returned on Tuesday and the arrest took place today, that was intentional on behalf of the federal government in order to keep the Rodellas in jail over the weekend. Do you want to respond to that?
I'm not going to comment on that.
What bodily injury did the victim allegedly suffer? It says that this resulted in bodily injury.
Yes, in one of the overt acts. At this point, I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just going to leave that with the facts that are presented in the indictment itself.
Do they share the home? Do the two men share a home together? The Rodellas, do they live in the same house?
I can't comment on that.
When they were arrested at the same time?
They were not. No.
So they were arrested from two different addresses?
2 different locations, yes, sir.
And both didn't put up any sort of fight or argument?
There was no difficulties in the arrest. No, ma'am.
Can either of you remember, or do you know of an instance in the past when there's been a federal indictment against and a federal arrest of a sitting sheriff in New Mexico?
I can't give you a specific instance at this point. I'm sorry?
Not be off the docket.
Thank you, Mike.
Were you around then?
Mike was.
I wasn't. Yeah.
So the indictment alleges that Rodella Jr. was acting under color of law because he's cooperating with his father, the sheriff.
Yes, because in count 1, that he conspired with his dad.
Okay.
And then under count 2, the way it's charged, because he was aiding and abetting for the substantive count with his father.
Okay, because the father's the elected official and he's helping him.
Yes.
So that's why he's under color of law.
Yes.
Is this arrest part of some new push by you guys to crack down on what seems like a pretty routine traffic stop, except for the fact that he wasn't in his actual unit?
Well, as I already stated, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office takes abuse of authority by public officials very seriously. And I would answer your question by saying that this isn't a new push. This is something that's been a priority to us all along. Any other questions? Thank you. Have a good morning.